For instance, the narrator of Berenice, Aegeus, never brings his intended bride to the altar. They never marry. She doesn't die either, though like Madeline and Usher, she is mistaken for dead and buried alive. The narrator of Ligeia, on the other hand, marries not once, but twice, 2 times, and both marriages end with the death of the bride. The artist's wife in the oval portrait dies as well, but this is the only one of the core marriage tales in which the narrator is not the groom. Aside from the shared theme of marriage, these stories also have in common the fact that they were revised by Poe later in his career. Some of the changes he made were not minor, and yet, because for better or worse they appeared in print in Poe's lifetime, editors have generally preferred the later over the earlier versions of the tales, leading to their establishment in the canon. I want to point out some of the more impactful alterations Poe made, starting with Berenice. Berenice first appeared in the Southern Literary Messenger in the spring of 1835. Among the changes Poe made to later versions of the story was the removal of 4 paragraphs immediately following Berenice's supposed death, which we later learned was actually a fit of catalepsy that gave only the appearance of death. Mabbott speculates that the grounds for the removal of these paragraphs may have been readers' complaints to the editor of the Messenger, T.W. White, which prompted a written apology from Poe that reads in part, "The subject is far too horrible. It approaches the very verge of bad taste, but I will not sin quite so egregiously again." Although Poe also advises White later in this letter that tales of this nature are good for magazine sales and promises to send more. The cut paragraphs contain, among other things, Aegeus's description of Berenice's body lying in her coffin, which may have been the egregious violation of taste Poe mentioned in his letter. The very atmosphere was redolent of death. The peculiar smell of the coffin sickened me, and I fancied a deleterious odor was already exhaling from the body. I remained rooted to the spot, and gazing upon the frightful length of the rigid body as it lay outstretched in the dark coffin without a lid. More interestingly, though, the cut material suggests not only that Berenice is still alive, but that the narrator even observes these indications, yet in his madness does nothing to prevent going forward with her burial. This is not an insignificant omission given the finale of the story. God of heaven, is it possible? Is it my brain that reeled, or was it indeed the finger of the enshrouded dead that stirred in the white cerement that bound it? Frozen with unutterable awe, I slowly raised my eyes to the countenance of the corpse. There had been a band around the jaws, but, I know not how, it was broken asunder. The livid lips were wreathed in a species of smile, and through the enveloping gloom, once again there glared upon me in too palpable a reality the white and glistening and ghastly teeth of Berenice. We'll move on now to Ligeia. Poe considered Ligeia his best story. It first appeared in the Baltimore periodical The American Museum in 1838. By the time it appeared in the Broadway Journal in 1845, a few months after reprinting Berenice in the same magazine, the most significant change was not a cut, but the addition of the poem The Conqueror Worm, which had been published separately from the story in Graham's magazine in 1843. As he had done with the poem The Haunted Palace in The Fall of the House of Usher, Poe included The Conqueror Worm, his most grotesque and despairing poem, and from the lips of his most bewitching and morbid female character, not only to showcase his poetic talent at a time when a volume of his collected poetry was in preparation, but to enhance the core theme of the story, the triumph of death over the lives of men and mortal affairs, humanity's futile chasing after shadows, grasping at universal mysteries, a truth that is always just out of reach, beyond the grave, and the madness of the pursuit. imagined in the poem as a macabre stage production before a solemn audience of heavenly beings. The motley drama, oh, be sure it shall not be forgot, with its phantom chased forevermore by a crowd that sees it not, through a circle that ever returneth in to the selfsame spot, and much of madness and more of sin, and horror the soul of the plot. Of the core marriage tales, the oval portrait was the last to appear in print, and when it did, it was under a different title, Life in Death. It wasn't until Poe revised the story for the Broadway Journal 3 years later that he gave it the present title, The Oval Portrait, emphasizing the art object itself rather than the theme it signifies. A much more significant change, however, is the elimination of the first paragraph, in which the narrator talks at length about his experience using opium and its effects on his mind. I had never swallowed opium before. Laudanum and morphine I had occasionally used, and about them should have had no reason to hesitate. But the solid drug I had never seen employed. I resolved to proceed by degrees. I would take a very small dose in the first instance. Should this prove impotent, I would repeat it, and so on, until I should find an abatement of the fever or obtain that sleep which was so pressingly requisite, and with which my reeling senses had not been blessed for now more than a week. No doubt it was this very reeling of my senses which blinded me to the folly of defining anything as either large or small, where I had no preconceived standard of comparison. I had not, at the moment, the faintest idea that what I conceived to be an exceedingly small dose of solid opium might, in fact, be an excessively large one. Poe's decision to cut this paragraph shifts the reader's attention away from the narrator in order to concentrate on the portrait and the sad story behind it. Indeed, a third of the story, in this much reduced version, consists of a long quotation taken from a catalogue of the paintings hanging on the walls of the chateau, which the narrator conveniently finds lying on his bed. What's important, then, is the story of the woman who died while sitting for the portrait, which we learn was painted by her own husband. Somewhat uncharacteristically, Poe seems to have wanted to emphasize the moral element of the story, which would have been harder to accomplish with an unreliable, drug-addled narrator, such as we find in Ligeia, for instance. At this point, I'm going to make further remarks on each of these stories, starting with Berenice. To emphasize comparisons and consistencies between them, I will organize my remarks using some of the same headings: the groom, the bride, her death, to which I will add, in the case of this story, the theme of monomania, although monomania too is a theme in all three stories. Starting then with the groom, the narrator, Aegeus. He begins with a short discourse on sorrow that in many respects anticipates Poe's own theory of beauty articulated in his essays on poetics. For Poe, the highest forms of beauty inevitably produce a kind of exquisite sadness in the beholder, an awareness of the impermanence of earthly things, and a recognition, too, of a higher beauty we can never fully apprehend, let alone directly experience, due to the limitations of our alienated mortal existence. Certain rare, sensitive persons, poetical by nature, may catch glimpses of the ideal, but can never achieve it. Here's what Aegeus says. Misery is manifold. The wretchedness of earth is multiform. Overreaching the wide horizon as the rainbow, its hues are as various as the hues of that arch. As distinct, too, yet as intimately blended. Overreaching the wide horizon as the rainbow. How is it that from beauty I have derived a type of unloveliness, from the covenant of peace, a simile of sorrow? But as in ethics evil is a consequence of good, so in fact out of joy is sorrow born. Either the memory of past bliss Is the anguish of today, or the agonies which are, have their origin in the ecstasies which might have been? To understand Aegeus's misery, then, for clearly he's quite miserable, we must try to ascertain what past bliss he remembers and what ecstasies he anticipated but failed to achieve. Is he talking about the intellectual pleasures of youth and his platonic relationship with his cousin Berenice before her mysterious illness? Or is he talking about some ideal existence out of space and out of time? He believes in metempsychosis, or reincarnation, the Platonic idea that not only is the soul eternal, but that after death it returns to inhabit a new body. This is an idea that Poe explores in several of the marriage tales, notably Ligeia. There is, the narrator tells us, a remembrance of aerial forms, of spiritual and meaning eyes, of sounds musical yet sad, a remembrance which will not be excluded, a memory like a shadow, vague, variable, indefinite, unsteady, and like a shadow, too, in the impossibility of my getting rid of it while the sunlight of my reason shall exist. It is his insistence on this idea, his dwelling upon it, his constant pursuit of occult knowledge, his pursuit of the ideal, his preference for visionary experiences over material facts that defines his character and makes him a most unreliable narrator. The realities of the world, he says, affected me as visions, and as visions only, while the wild ideas of the land of dreams became, in turn, not the material of my everyday existence, but in very deed that existence utterly and solely in itself. Like William Wilson, he claims to be born from a race of visionaries, and like Roderick Usher, he spends much of his time sequestered in the family library where he claims to have been born, strangely, lost in esoteric thoughts and flights of fancy, hardly suitable husband material for a woman like Berenice, whose apparent love for him, ironically, seems to be the source of her mysterious illness, as it is for the woman in the oval portrait, as we'll see later. So moving on to the bride, Berenice, she's the opposite of the narrator. Comfortable in her body, finding pleasure in nature rather than books, she is generally happy, vivacious, pure sunshine to his black rainbow. He draws the contrast best himself. Berenice and I were cousins, and we grew up together in my paternal halls. Yet differently we grew, I, ill of health and buried in gloom, she, agile, graceful, and overflowing with energy. Hers the ramble on the hillside, mine the studies of the cloister. I living within my own heart and addicted body and soul to the most intense and painful meditation. She roaming carelessly through life with no thought of the shadows in her path or the silent flight of the raven-winged hours. She's extraordinarily beautiful, as are all the women in these stories, but that beauty awakens no physical desire or feelings of love in the narrator, who appreciates only the effect it produces on his mind. Her beauty is a kind of stimulant to his imagination, a prompt for his meditations. During the brightest days of her unparalleled beauty, most surely I had never loved her. In the strange anomaly of my existence, feelings with me had never been of the heart, and my passions always were of the mind. In the silence of my library at night, she had flitted by my eyes, and I had seen her, not as the living and breathing Berenice, but as the Berenice of a dream. Not as a being of the earth, earthy, but as the abstraction of such a being. Not as a thing to admire, but to analyze. Not as an object of love, but as the theme of the most abstruse, although desultory, speculation. I'm going to move on to her death. Of course, Berenice does not actually die. Her illness, if we accept the narrator's observations of her wasting symptoms, is never diagnosed. But she does suffer, like Madeline Usher, from what he describes not as catalepsy, but rather as a species of epilepsy, not unfrequently terminating in trance itself. Trance, he says, very nearly resembling positive dissolution or death, and from which her manner of recovery was, in most instances, startling abrupt. That she's mistaken for dead and ends up buried alive should hardly be surprising to us then, though in point of chronology, this is one of Poe's earliest tales touching on that motif. The circumstances of the discovery on some points resemble those of Mademoiselle Lafourcade in The Premature Burial. In that story, the woman is buried alive, but fortuitously rescued by her grieving lover when he opens her grave to retrieve a lock of her hair. Berenice might have been so fortunate were it not for the horrifying and revolting mutilation she suffers at the hands of her rescuer. The reason for this mutilation, as the narrator explains, is his obsession with Berenice's teeth, the one physical feature that remains constant, unaffected, as the rest of her face is hideously transformed by disease. The forehead was high, he writes, and very pale and singularly placid, and the once jetty hair fell partially over it, and overshadowed the hollow temples with innumerable ringlets, now of a vivid yellow. This is an inversion, by the way, of the blonde-haired Rowena's very similar transformation in Ligeia, and jarring discordantly in their fantastic character with the reigning melancholy of the countenance. The eyes were lifeless and lusterless and seemingly pupilless, and I shrank involuntarily from their glassy stare to the contemplation of the thin and shrunken lips. They parted, and in a smile of peculiar meaning, the teeth of the changed Berenice disclosed themselves slowly to my view. Would to God that I had never beheld them, or that, having done so, I had died. While Berenice's disease is never sufficiently explained, it seems to increase in proportion to the narrator's neglect of her, and may even be partly imagined by him. In the 1835 version of the story, he admits to the, and I'm quoting that story, immoderate use of opium. Now, Poe later cut that line, but it certainly would raise doubts about the veracity of his observations, as it will for the narrator of Ligeia. However that may be, moving on to the topic of monomania, he goes on for several pages explaining his own mental disorder, which he defines as a disease of a monomaniac character of a novel and extraordinary form. This monomania consisted in a morbid irritability of those properties of the mind in metaphysical science termed the attentive. It is more than probable that I am not understood, but I fear indeed that it is in no manner possible to convey to the mind of the merely general reader an adequate idea of that nervous intensity of interest with which, in my case, the powers of meditation busied and buried themselves in the contemplation of even the most ordinary objects of the universe. Among these ordinary objects are, of course, Berenice's teeth. My cousin had departed from the chamber, he says, but from the disordered chamber of my brain had not, alas, departed, and would not be driven away, the white and ghastly spectrum of the teeth. Not a speck on their surface, not a shade on their enamel, not an indenture in their edges, but what that brief period of her smile had sufficed to brand in upon my memory. I saw them now, that is, he sees them in her absence, even more unequivocally than I beheld them then. The teeth, they were here and there and everywhere, and visibly and palpably before me, long, narrow, and excessively white, with the pale lips writhing about them as in the very moment of their first terrible development. In the multiplied objects of the external world, he continues, I had no thoughts but for the teeth. For these I longed with a frenzied desire. All other matters and all different interests became absorbed in their single contemplation. They alone were present to the mental eye, and they, in their sole individuality, became the essence of my mental life. I held them in every light. I turned them in every attitude. I surveyed their characteristics. I dwelt upon their peculiarities. I pondered upon their conformation. I mused upon the alteration in their nature. I shuddered as I assigned to them in imagination a sensitive and sentient power, and even when assisted by the lips, a capability of moral expression. It is this monomania, of course, the narrator's obsession with the one fixed, unchanging feature of Berenice's visage, her immaculate teeth, that drives the story to its horrible climax. He has no memory of digging up Berenice's coffin, no memory of extracting her teeth as she dug her nails into his hands trying to stop him. I think that's one of the most gruesome details in the story. He seems no longer even to recognize the 32 small white and ivory looking substances scattered about the floor as teeth. They are an abstraction of beauty, beauty liberated from corruptible flesh, from the trammels of language shaped by lip and tongue, from the words he has studied all his life, but that have failed to fully disclose a higher reality and bliss beyond the black rainbow that he talks about at the beginning of the story. Aegeus's monomania also infects the narrators of the other two stories covered in this presentation, and with similar results. Because of the centrality of Ligeia in the canon of Poe's short fiction, I'm going to break from chronology and talk next about the Oval Portrait, which is written after Ligeia. This is a story that has a kind of moral certainty and transparency that I think is more characteristic of a writer like Nathaniel Hawthorne, and far less typical of Poe. Once again, I'm going to anchor my remarks to the groom, the bride, and her death, but I'm going to touch as well on the topic of Poe's Gothicism. I'm going to put it right at the top. I've talked about the Gothic before in The Pit and the Pendulum, The Fall of the House of Usher, and Bransby's Boarding School in William Wilson. But in this story, The Oval Portrait, as well as Ligeia, the Gothic finds its most direct and elaborate expression. In keeping with Poe's predilection for close, carceral settings like the library in Berenice, the Oval Portrait takes place in the remote turret of an abandoned castle in the Apennine Mountains in Italy. Its bizarre architecture and tattered and antique furnishings enhance the mysterious atmosphere and the spookiness of the painting when it is finally discovered by the narrator. The chateau, he tells us, was one of those piles of commingled gloom and grandeur which has so long frowned among the Apennines, not less in fact than in the fancy of Mrs. Radcliffe. Now, Anne Radcliffe was a real person, an English author famous for novels like The Romance of the Forest and The Mysteries of Udolpho, which helped to elevate the Gothic novel to something of an independent art form in the 1790s. These works popularized narrative techniques and tropes like the ruined castle, secret passageways, and luminous spectral effects that by the time Poe was writing had become rather shop-worn and cliché. To mention Radcliffe here as he does, Poe may have been pandering to public taste. So moving on now to the groom. As I mentioned earlier, the Oval Portrait has scarcely any plot. The only other character besides the narrator is his servant Pedro, who says nothing and is largely absent after the first paragraph. As for the narrator himself, much of the background provided in the earliest version of the story, Life and Death, including how he sustained the injuries that led him to seek shelter in the chateau in the first place, has been cut by Poe. For the tale to be effective, he needs someone to observe and respond to the painting, and for the haunting properties of the painting to be convincing, the reader cannot question the observer. Unlike so many of Poe's narrators, then, this one comes across as alert, rational, and even-tempered. Unsettled by the initial impression the portrait leaves on him, he shuts his eyes to make sure, he explains, that my vision had not deceived me, to calm and subdue my fancy for a more sober and more certain gaze. We have little reason to impugn his analysis of the portrait or to question his conclusion that the spell of the picture lay in an eerie, absolute lifelikeliness of expression. The real interest, then, lies in the history of the portrait itself, which the narrator finds recorded in a printed catalog of artworks displayed in the chateau. The painter, we are informed, was married to the woman in the painting and obsessed with exalting and eternalizing her beauty on canvas. Poe would have been sympathetic, I think, to such lofty pursuits, but would have recognized as well the risk to one's individual happiness and the damage it could wreak on human relationships. Like Aegeus, the painter, studious, austere, and lost in reveries, is less interested in his wife as a person than as an idea, as the object of his artistic gaze. His wife, on the other hand, is, like Berenice, the opposite of her husband. A maiden of rarest beauty, we're told, and not more lovely than full of glee, all light and smiles, and frolicsome as the young fawn, loving and cherishing all things. And yet she loves her husband, hating only the art which was her rival, and yet willing to sit for her portrait, humble and obedient. And of course, this leads to her death. Unlike Berenice, however, her physical decline is attributed directly to the artist and his obsession. I'm quoting the story. He would not see that the light which fell so ghastly in that lone turret withered the health and the spirits of his bride. So long as he continues to paint, the more precipitous is her decline. There's something vampiric almost in his ability to transfer life from her body to the painted image. The tints which he spread upon the canvas, we are told, were drawn from the cheeks of her who sate beside him. Vampirism is a subtle motif in Ligeia as well, though we cannot be entirely certain who is draining the life force from the narrator's second wife, Lady Rowena. Is it the spirit of his first wife, the lately departed Ligeia, returning to Earth and taking possession of Rowena's body? Or is it the narrator who, still enthralled with the former, poisons the latter in a macabre, drug-addled fantasy of reunion with his first love? So to discuss, I'm going to put the same headings back up that I used for the oval portrait, just in a different order. As is so often the case, the ambiguities of this story originate with the narrator, the groom, who from the opening sentence gives indications of his unreliability. His memory is feeble, he says. He cannot remember how he met Ligeia, or when, or even precisely where, and yet he records her physical appearance with such attention to detail that it requires several pages to complete the picture, with over half of it devoted to her eyes alone, and we know from Poe's poetry how important eyes are. Then there's the seeming inconsistency between his early statement that Ligeia is no more and the last sentence of the story where he claims his once lost love now stands before him fully reincarnated. Further complicating his account of events is his apparent opium addiction. While Poe removed references to the drug in the revised versions of both the oval portrait and Berenice, the narrator of Ligeia describes himself from the beginning as a slave in the trammels of opium, so that as the crisis of Rowena's illness builds and signs of supernatural influence intensify, he questions his own observations. As I stepped beneath the light of the censer, two circumstances of a startling nature attracted my attention. I had felt that some palpable, although invisible object had passed lightly by my person, and I saw that there lay upon the golden carpet, in the very middle of the rich luster thrown from the censer, a shadow, a faint, indefinite shadow of angelic aspect, such as might be fancied for the shadow of a shade. But I was wild with the excitement of an immoderate dose of opium, and heeded these things but little, nor spoke of them to Rowena. He expresses similar doubts a moment later when, fetching a goblet of wine, he observes drips of ruby-colored fluid falling into the vessel, This is a critical passage in the tale as it decides for many readers whether some supernatural agency is at work, hastening a transfusion of Ligeia's vital spirit into Rowena's wasting body, or if it is merely the delusion of a drug-addled narrator in the act of murdering his wife. As Rowena was in the act of raising the wine to her lips, I saw, or may have dreamed that I saw, fall within the goblet as if from some invisible spring in the atmosphere of the room, 3 or 4 large drops of a brilliant and ruby-colored fluid. If this I saw, not so Rowena. She swallowed the wine unhesitatingly, and I forbore to speak to her of a circumstance which must, after all, I considered, have been but the suggestion of a vivid imagination, rendered morbidly active by the terror of the lady, by the opium, and by the hour. Which brings us to the women in the story. Actually, this should be brides and not bride. The first, known only by her given name, Ligeia, and the second, Lady Rowena Trevanion of Tremaine, whom the narrator despises in proportion as he adores the other. The first woman he loves, the second becomes a sacrifice to that love. Ligeia is, without question, the most powerful of Poe's female characters. Like the women in Poe's later love lyrics, her appearance is a kind of mystical experience. Ligeia's beauty passed into my spirit, the narrator tells us, there dwelling as in a shrine. Her raven black hair and her scintillant gazelle eyes especially accent the beauty of beings either above or apart from the earth, he rhapsodizes. She came and departed as a shadow. I was never made aware of her entrance into my closed study, save by the dear music of her low, sweet voice as she placed her marble hand upon my shoulder. In beauty of face, no maiden ever equaled her. It was the radiance of an opium dream, an airy and spirit-lifting vision more wildly divine than the fantasies which hovered about the slumbering souls of the daughters of Delos. She is the very embodiment of art, radiant, marmoreal, musical, but also strange, intense, and vaguely menacing. No less important than her physical beauty, however, are her extraordinary intellectual accomplishments. I have spoken of the learning of Ligeia, he says. It was immense, such as I have never known in woman. But where breathes the man who has traversed and successfully all the wide areas of moral and physical and mathematical science? The acquisitions of Ligeia were gigantic, were astounding, yet I was sufficiently aware of her infinite supremacy to resign myself, with a childlike confidence, to her guidance through the chaotic world of metaphysical investigation. Like Berenice and the woman in the oval portrait, Ligeia sickens unaccountably. Perhaps she is too much like the men in the stories. Too intellectual, too esoteric, too poetical to continue long in this world. And yet, like Poe himself, she's divided between head and heart, heaven and earth. Impelled, he tells us, toward a wisdom too divinely precious not to be forbidden, yet clinging desperately to mortal love and material existence, wanting both, but so far achieving neither. She possesses a fierce volitional energy, a wild desire for life, quite unlike anything we have seen in Poe's other characters, male or female. This desire is expressed in the Glanville passage Poe placed as an epigraph at the beginning of the story, and which gets repeated no less than 3 times in the course of the narrative. It reads in part, "Who knoweth the mysteries of the will with its vigor? For God is but a great will pervading all things by nature of its intentness. Man doth not yield himself to the angels, nor unto death utterly, save only through the weakness of his feeble will." The narrator is reminded of this passage by the expression of Ligeia's eyes, and they're the last words she utters from her deathbed. The notion that one might overcome death through force of will is apparently what drives the narrator to relocate to England and remarry Lady Rowena, who unwittingly becomes the vessel of Ligeia's reincarnation, although by whose will exactly remains an open question. After Ligeia dies, the narrator seems not to have any interest at all in remarrying. It was only in a moment of mental alienation, he says, not with any determination or desire of his own, that he wed Lady Rowena, as though Ligeia herself, if you follow his suggestion, had chosen in advance the corporeal vessel in which to make her return. Indeed, Rowena seems the very opposite of Ligeia. She is fair-haired and blue-eyed, and seems little interested in the pursuit of esoteric knowledge. There is, in fact, little love between her and the narrator. That my wife dreaded the fierce moodiness of my temper, that she shunned me and loved me but little, I could not help perceiving. But it gave me rather pleasure than otherwise. I loathed her with a hatred belonging more to demon than to man. Not surprisingly, by the second month of their marriage, Rowena falls ill. We can talk about her death now. There are two factors that contribute to her sickness. The first and most obvious is the narrator's neglect and even hatred of his new bride. He pays little attention to her, dwelling instead for long hours on the memory of Ligeia. Her image, her name develops into monomania. My memory flew back, oh, with what intensity of regret, to Ligeia, the beloved, the august, the beautiful, the entombed. I reveled in recollections of her purity, of her wisdom, of her lofty, her ethereal nature, of her passionate, her idolatrous love. Now, then, did my spirit fully and freely burn with more than all the fires of her own. In the excitement of my opium dreams, for I was habitually fettered in the shackles of the drug, I would call aloud upon her name during the silence of the night or among the sheltered recesses of the glens by day, as if, through the wild eagerness, the solemn passion, the consuming ardor of my longing for the departed, I could restore her to the pathway she had abandoned. Ah, could it be forever upon the earth? The other factor contributing to Rowena's decline is the Gothic design and furnishings of the gloomy and dreary abbey the newlyweds call home. So this brings us finally to the Gothicism of the tale. And specifically, what stands out the most is the bizarre pentagonal bridal chamber, which has almost as powerful an influence on their minds as the House of Usher had on its inhabitants. Its design is occult, almost ritualistic. Every surface in the room, stone, metal, fabric, is decorated, carved, cast, or woven with exotic and grotesque figures. Most spectacular of all are the massive granite sarcophagi plundered from the tombs of ancient Egypt. The narrator expresses surprise that Rowena's family, attracted by his apparent wealth, would yet consent to a marriage that would place her in such a macabre dwelling. Where were the souls of the haughty family, he snidely remarks, when through thirst of gold they permitted to pass the threshold of an apartment so bedecked, a maiden and a daughter so beloved? The chamber has the atmosphere of a dream. Its effects are hallucinatory and disorienting, like the dungeon in the pit and the pendulum. Nothing is quite what it seems at first glance. As an example, here's the narrator's description of the tapestry that lines the walls and furniture of the room. The material was the richest cloth of gold. It was spotted all over at irregular intervals with arabesque figures about a foot in diameter, and wrought upon the cloth in patterns of the most jetty black. But these figures partook of the true character of the arabesque only when regarded from a single point of view. To one entering the room, they bore the appearance of simple monstrosities, but upon farther advance, this appearance gradually departed. He saw himself surrounded by an endless succession of the ghastly forms which belonged to the superstition of the Norman, or arise in the guilty slumbers of the monk, possibly a reference to another famous Gothic novel titled The Monk. The phantasmagoric effect was vastly heightened by the artificial introduction of a strong, continual current of wind behind the draperies, giving a hideous and uneasy animation to the whole. This deliberate derangement of the senses, through both artistic and pharmaceutical means, makes the end of the story highly uncertain. As we saw in the frantic conclusion of The Fall of the House of Usher, which was published a year after Ligeia, a sequence of ambiguous events intensifies the tone of the narrative and builds momentum towards a climax that leaves the reader with more questions than answers. When the story Ligeia was reprinted in the New York New World magazine in 1845, the editor included the following note, remarking on this enigma. Mark the exquisite art, the editor writes, which keeps constantly before the reader the ruined and specter-haunted mind of the narrator, and so suggests a possible explanation of the marvels of the story, without in the least weakening its vigor as an exposition of the mystical thesis which the tale is designed to illustrate and enforce. I'll wait until we're together in class to make a closer examination of the dramatic finale of Ligeia, with its mysterious shadows and rustling, its weirdly colored fires and dripping fluids, Rowena's miraculous revivals, and sudden, appalling relapses into decay until Ligeia takes full possession either of Rowena's body or the narrator's mind. And I'll close by leaving you to ponder on that question.